Time was as I was, but neither that time nor that I are anymore. The whole night was out of joint. I'd had too many drinks. Time ran fluid, invisible, sad. Looking out, I could see a ship moving upstream, its running lights bright points in the night. I thought with a laugh, why worry about time? Let these three quotations be the hobnails in Soul's insurgent and ready to stomp. Or in other, less woozy words, it's alongside these three quotations that I want today to assemble some thoughts regarding the time of novel, the time of life, and the time of our lives. That the time of the novel, the time of life, and the time of our lives involve one another without being resolvable into one another, and that there therefore exists a tense tension between them, is evidenced in the specific novel from which these three quotations are taken. This is Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Bracketed by a prologue and an epilogue that take place in the now of the time of narrative, I am an invisible man, Invisible Man begins. Invisible Man is otherwise the retrospectively narrated story of a black American college student turned communist orator turned reclusive Harlem hibernator. Whether you're on time or running out of time, whether you're worrying intensely about time or running fugitively out of time, temporality is undoubtedly a preoccupation in Invisible Man. Upon first arriving on Manhattan Island with the intention of earning money with which to complete his education, the novel's nameless protagonist initially determines to do everything to schedule, to be on time, to get a watch. Let's cut to the chase and strategically call this commitment to schedule Crusoean. For who but the champion of the first novel written in English, Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, was so proud of having regularly divided his island time into several employments? Who else but the never idle Crusoe was so proud of his busyness? Let's not forget either that to narrate is itself to tell, to tally, to recount, to account, to take account. As Anne Banfield has taught us, novelistic time is countable time. Events get counted. The time of the novel is time as measurement, or as she puts it, the knowledge of the clock. As we also know, however, within the sentences of novelistic narration move minds capable of reflecting. In Banfield's terms, thought gets represented. Novelistic consciousnesses represent time. Let's again cut to the chase and strategically say that what this gives us is consciousnesses that are representable, presentable in all manners of the word. Ellison's novel without doubt inhabits this counterpoint between what is representable and what is countable or what counts. I am in the great American tradition, the novel asserts. But from the off it also buries itself in refusal, by which I mean both that Invisible Man is concerned with what is neither represented nor representable, hence its title Invisible Man, and that it thinks with a laugh as well as with a watch. This is a novel that is moreover pulled to and fro by what it calls slow time, which sometimes goes as fast as drag time, and which all gin, jazz and dreams in Harlem aside, will eventually bring us to the topic of the time of our lives. Ellison's American novel was first published in 1952. Already, by mentioning the date of Invisible Man, I've signalled an interest I have in the shorelines of what is commonly considered the modernist period, and what our conference implicitly brackets as the time of the European avant-garde. The pull or drag of shorelines is, I think, one of Invisible Man's preoccupations as well, and saying how will be a way to say more about what I mean by the time of the novel and the time of life. In the novel's epilogue, the nameless protagonist is again in the same hole he calls home in the novel's prologue, a basement in a border area of Harlem in a building rented strictly to whites. In what he calls an act of sabotage, the Invisible Man has enlightened his hole by means of 1,369 bulbs, expensive filament bulbs that get their energy from a company called Monopolated Light and Power, who provide a service for which our protagonist pays nothing at all. It's from this ambivalent vantage point that he tells us something he reckons he's learned about reality, history, and his life. It's this, quote, "Once you get used to it, reality is as irresistible as a club, and I was clubbed into the cellar before I caught the hint. Perhaps that's the way it had to be, I don't know. nor do I know whether accepting the lesson has placed me in the rear or in the avant-garde. That, perhaps, is a lesson for history, and I'll leave such decisions to Jack and his ilk while I try belatedly to study the lesson of my own life. In the rear or in the avant-garde, I don't know. The decision is discarded. Exactitude as to such matters is left to history and to dialecticians like Brother Jack, the Communist Party man with and for whom the Invisible Man works during his time as political orator in New York. But still, though the decision between rear and avant is refused by a man who has made his abode in a basement in a border area in a building rented strictly to whites, the question is also there, posed, because the I that speaks these words is both ahead of and behind his own life. The I that speaks these words is at once ahead of and behind his own life because it is as a novelistic I, as an I hibernating in novelistic time, that this I speaks. Invisible Man is, as I have said, for the most part retrospectively narrated, but the novel commences with a prologue temporally situated after the events the novel contains has taken place. The experienced I of the prologue, which the I of the epilogue rejoins, is other than and yet the same as the I whose experiences it goes on to narrate. To be clear, there is nothing particularly remarkable about this, and certainly nothing revolutionary. This is the way novelistic I's are, often are. This is what novelistic narratives can do and have done. We need only think of Charles Dickens's David Copperfield and DC or CD's decision to begin my life with the beginning of my life. To begin my life with the beginning of my life is first to register two sorts of life, life as lived and life accounted for, and secondly, to take account of life lived according to the accountant's greater life experience, to measure the former's events by the latter's maturity. It is within this measured, precisely presentable belatedness that the Invisible Man's life emerges as something the Invisible Man has perspective on. In other words, it is by means of the relation between the time of the I of the prologue and epilogue and the time of the I that this experienced I tells us about, that the novel's black protagonist gains himself a life upon which to work, a life studiously to study the lesson of, while simultaneously yet belatedly living through. Again, this is what novels can do and have done. This is the story, moreover, of the romance building, a story that the Invisible Man explicitly breaks in on, but which also wants to break beyond. The story of an African-American Southern schoolboy who progresses first to college and then to speechifying alongside New York City communists. Invisible Man not only shows that it already knows all about these novelistic timings of progression paired with hindsight, which is also, of course, the lifetime of the white bourgeois individual. How is the campus part of his life, the protagonist wonders when confronted with the world of one of his college's wealthy white funders. The campus is part of my life, and I know my life rather well, says the trustee. How did one learn his life rather well, thinks the protagonist as a young invisible man. He is moreover flummoxed when this wealthy white patron is referred to as a trustee of consciousness. But really, he shouldn't be. For if Invisible Man is a novel that has learned its novelistic tenses, it also refuses them. I refuse it, I won't buy it. All the way through, the Invisible Man keeps recoiling from forms of life that would render him more recognisable, more representable, less invisible. From college, he gets himself kicked out. From industrious employment, the time he puts in at a paint factory is chaotic and ends in strange injury, and from party politics in the end too. A hibernation is a covert preparation for a more overt action, he tells us in the novel's prologue. Maybe so, but as we've already heard, a hibernation can involve sabotage. There are in fact two endings to Ellison's novel, which is to say there's an ultimatum. The real decision for him is not between the rear and the avant-garde, but between the wise eye of the prologue and the progressive work it does on the other eye, the unexperienced eye, or the riotous life into which Harlan collectively rips in the story's concluding scenes the Invisible Man struggles as a solitaire eye to observe. Let's again get strategic and call this an automaton between the time of the novel and the time of our lives. That it is an automaton punctuated by the transferal of tension from the throat of the novel's narrator to the crowds he later orates to is without doubt significant. From a throat evidently tense and an interiority gripped with tension, the novel's tensity displaces to the pent-up tension of Harlem at large. After an unarmed black man is shot and his shooting down is, in the protagonist's word, dramatised by his funeral, Harlem tenses. Quote, "And through the haze I again felt the tension. There was no denying it. It was there, and something had to be done before it simmered away in the heat." End quote. Tension remains, but gets felt differently as it drags from the individual to the collective. But what is also important is the way in which this collective tension is recounted, how it is tensed. Because when we listen again to that last quotation, we can hear again, both at the same time, two eyes speaking. Both an experienced eye and the eye whose experiences are being represented, which is to say, an eye whose experiences are in the process of being made presentable. And through the haze I again felt the tension. There was no denying it. It was there and something had to be done before it simmered away in the heat. Between two eyes separated in time, these lines are thought. There is no denying it is what I once thought I now realise, therefore there was no denying it. Here the simmering tension of the collective is literally sentenced according to the individual. In other words, the simmering tension of the collective is still enswayed to the syntax of the individual, an eye in the progress of studying his own life, an eye whose work is precisely to count out, recount and contain the events of that life by living them with measured belatedness. Up against this novelistic time or time as measurement tugs the time of our lives, which is time surging, or perhaps time insurgent, laughing time, or even, to adopt the lexicon of Antonio Negri in Time for Revolution, something we might call liberated time, because liberation consists in the destruction of the structural dimensions of time as measure. I thought with a laugh, why worry about time? This is what the Invisible Man thinks, while but also after Harlem is likewise laughing, a joint apart, out of joint, joyfully looting, even, according to some of those the Invisible Man runs into, having the time of its life. You call this living, one man responds when questioned about the burning of a huge tenement building, a building in which those burning it also live. I realise I'm running quite fast here myself. I also realise I risk sounding as if I'm moving towards a purely now time, or at least of valorising some sort of tenseless immediacy. That's not quite my intention, though tenselessness is certainly interesting. As is the proximity of what is tenseless to what is senseless, that word so often invoked when riotous insurgencies are spoken of. How often were the events of summer 2011 in the UK described as senseless? Events which began as the events at the end of Invisible Man begin, with the shooting down of a black man by the police. I'll go out on a bit of a limb and say it's perhaps not simply happenstance that there too the collective was later sentenced according to the individual, according to so many minutely individualised court cases. But again, I'm running away with myself. As the Invisible Man also asks of his audience, bear with me. Or, as the expanded version of my third quotation, which you have, goes, the time is now, the sign across the river began. But with history stomping upon me with hobnailed boots, I thought with a laugh, why worry about time? This from the same man who was once determined to be on time for all his appointments, to get a watch and watch it, to do everything to schedule. Bear with him. Time was as I was, but neither that time nor that I are anymore. What else does this sentence state but the Invisible Man's explicit, conscious knowledge of novelistic clockwork, of the way in which his own narrative is working? And what else is this also but an almost echo of something the young Stephen Dedler thinks about in James Joyce's Ulysses, a novel that from Invisible Man's perspective was published a world war and a wide ocean ago, a whole time zone ago. At night I practiced writing and studied Joyce, Ellison tells us in an interview. Joyce for Ellison is not novel time so much as night time. But still, compare time was as I was, but neither that time nor that I are any more, with what I'm thinking of Stephen Dedalus thinking, which is the phrase, I am another now and yet the same. From the shore of Sandymount Strand all the way to the borderlands of Harlem, the Invisible Man drags Stephen Dedalus into this, before Stephen Dedalus is even mentioned, as he indeed actually is many pages later in Ellison's novel, when the Invisible Man remembers the teachings of one of his old college professors, Woodridge. Not insignificantly, the Invisible Man remembers the college professor teaching that Stephen's problem, like ours, and this was a quotation, was not actually one of creating the uncreated conscience of his race, but of creating the uncreated features of his face. Our task, Woodridge tells his class, is that of making ourselves individuals. But what I was about to say is that both sentences, Joyce's and Ellison's, the Invisible Man's and Stephen Dedalus's, get right at the techniques of the narratorial belatedness I have described, which is a belatedness that contains the following oddness. This is that when novels represent consciousness, or when consciousness is made representable, the past tense does not receive its normal past reading. Because individual consciousness is, according to Anne Banfield's argument, always now, always immediate, the past, when rendered narratorially, becomes temporaneous, collocative, or simultaneous with now. Or, the now of life lived lives on according to life accounted for's terms. The time of life lived is subsumed by the time of life accounted for, by the work the latter does. This is how an individual consciousness becomes representable. This is how consciousness becomes recognised as individual. Recognition, by the way, being a word that the Invisible Man shuns. Irresponsibility is part of my invisibility, he says. Responsibility, he also says, rests upon recognition, and recognition is a form of agreement. A form of agreement, we should add, that is also a sort of contract, perhaps a peculiarly novelistic one, perhaps also a peculiarly individualistic one. Ellison's novel already knows all this, but nonetheless, Seymour Chapman spells it out for us with recourse to a neat and familiar distinction between story and discourse, one we've already heard about this morning. Narratives, Chapman says, establish a sense of present moment, narrative now, so to speak. If the narrative is over, there are perforce two nows, that of discourse, the moment occupied by the narrator in the present tense, I am going to tell you the following story, and that of the story, the moment that action began to transpire, usually in the preterite. If the narrator is totally absent or covert, only the story now emerges clearly. The narrator of Invisible Man is undoubtedly covert, but in a way that is contrary to Chapman's assertion. For sure, there are moments in the novel where the narrator is doing exactly what Chapman describes. Here is how the nameless protagonist of Ellison's novel remembers himself feeling when he is made responsible for driving his college's rich white trustee, the trustee of consciousness aforementioned. Until now, and although I could recognise the founder and Dr. Bledsoe among them, the figures in the old college photographs displayed in the library had never seemed actually to be alive. But now I felt that I was sharing in a great work, and with the car leaping leisurely beneath the pressure of my foot, I identified myself with the rich man reminiscing on the rear seat. It's an identification the Invisible Man will have come to have given up upon. But the point is that this momentary identification with this rich man reminiscing is also operating at the level of narratorial or novelistic form. That is, this is not only an identification. Covertly and yet also explicitly, it's a form of occupation too. To drag Chapman's talk of story and discourse into the Invisible Man's terms, the now of this quotation is the now of time as I was, but neither that time nor that I are anymore. 2 pages later, in case we didn't get it yet, the now of the narrator, the same now as that of the Invisible Man holed up in his illicitly enlightened basement, re-emerges momentarily. I know now, one sentence so very wisely begins. bracketed out of the progressing narrative, but also therefore breaking in on it. The statement that time was as I was, but neither that time nor that I are any more, is exactly a covert yet explicit statement about how I, or how my consciousness, comes to be presentable in all manners of the word. I am another now, and yet the same, except I am not necessarily the same. The I of the invisible man is not quite the same as the I Stephen describes. To say I am another now and yet the same is to speak the language of endurance. The invisible man, by contrast, refuses to say whether or not he endures. Instead, he can only say that neither that time nor that I are any more. Stephen holds the now. The invisible man laughs at it. Still, by dragging Stephen into things, invisible man also asserts that it is and it isn't in the great American tradition. Like Stephen, invisible man is on the shorelands, and once preoccupied with the time of the novel, occupying it, and at the same time running out of it, dragging out of it. Indeed, it doesn't seem to me to be coincidental that when the tension in Harlem begins simmering, when they start taking the joint apart, as a cab driver puts it, and the whole night gets out of joint, drunken, dragged upstream, the invisible man inadvertently dresses up as a figure called Reinhardt, a dapper, suited figure who is also apparently irreverent. Malcolm X once described a zoot suit as a killer-diller coat with the drape sheet, wheat pleats, and shoulders padded like a lunatic's cell. 1943 saw the so-called zoot suit riots happen in LA between white Marines and Latino, Filipino, and African-American youths. It is as this extravagantly multivalent, zoot-suited Reinhardt, and not as the I he has been and continues to be, that the invisible man observes most of the riotous events in Harlem unfold. Ellison's novel is tensed with taut temporalities. It doesn't necessarily resist their reality. A black man resisting reality in the form of a revolver in the hands of an arresting officer, as the novel puts it, is how that same man gets shot down. But the novel does nonetheless imagine a question about those taut temporalities, about the tenses of the presentable individual. And perhaps on that point, it's worth restating something Negri writes about in the preamble to the text before mentioned, Time for Revolution. This is that the imagination is the most concrete of temporal powers. Thank you.